spell of Wagner and Liszt, and so his harmonic vocabulary is complicated, shall we say. And some of Scriabin's works are so chromatic, in fact, that he just does away with a key signature. It's just blank as if it were in C. But in fact, he has to put accidentals by every single note then, because there is no key signature that would really accommodate that movement or that composition. The key feeling then, because of so much chromaticism, is very, very vague, so vague, in fact, that his compositions are certainly pointing in the direction of atonality, which is soon to come. He also builds chords on unusual intervals and uses what started out as standard chords but puts quite a few chromatic alterations on them so that they're just about unrecognizable. This intense amount of chromaticism exercised some influence on the composers around him and soon after. But that is really the only identifiable influence that Scriabin has, that his music is just so tremendously chromatic, but nothing else really rubbed off on other composers. Your textbook mentions one of his most famous and most typical works, Poem of Ecstasy, Poème d'Extase. It's a fitting title because he's trying to create a state of mystical rapture. In that regard, it certainly fits the romantic ethos. Other nationalistic composers here. Czechoslovakia is represented, among others, by Smetana. Smetana. You may never have done a piece by Smetana. You may never. There are a couple of others. One of them is Janacek. And we'll do without all the diacritical marks. There's so many of them. Another one that you may never have done anything by, I may never, although he's considered a kind of major composer, major nationalist composer anyway. And then the most familiar from Czechoslovakia is Dvorak. So those three go together. And Dvorak has enough different kinds of music that is of lasting importance that you may very well run into Dvorak if you haven't already. Czechoslovakia, remember, is a place that's been conquered and kicked around and had their boundaries redrawn and renamed quite a few times. So it's a little bit variable. During the time of these composers anyway, they had been ruled by Austria, which was certainly a major Western European place. And because of their oppressors, shall we say, they were in pretty close contact with what was going on in the mainstream of European music. So, as a result, the music of these three composers, most particularly Dvorak and a little bit less to the others, doesn't differ very radically from mainstream European romantic music. It's fairly similar, as we say, particularly Dvorak. Smetana's style would be influenced a lot by Liszt. Dvorak would clearly be influenced by Brahms. And it's really Janacek who makes the most conscious effort to be different. Different from everybody, actually. And so he tends to model his music and his musical style after peasant songs and peasant speech of the Moravians. The Moravians actually had quite a few of them who came and settled in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, in Pennsylvania. And when I was in high school, there was still some publisher who published pieces that on the cover said the Moravian Choral Series. And what I remember about that is that they're fairly difficult to sing, and had a kind of a big, rich, romantic sound to them. So the Moravians at this time are kind of important people when it comes to music, and their influence on Janacek was very substantial. The little bitty country Norway is represented by Grieg, G-R-I-E-G. We sort of feel that Grieg is not in the highest echelon of the major composers, but he's one of the first in line in the second tier, I would think. He is a pretty significant composer. Best known for a piano concerto in A minor and 2 orchestral suites that he arranged for music he wrote for a play by Ibsen called Peer Gynt, P-E-E-R-G-Y-N-T. Music from Peer Gynt is often played for children's concerts, very, very attractive. The piano concerto in A minor used to be played in the major piano competitions of the world, but it isn't any longer. And I think because they just figure that in relation to other piano concertos, it's a little bit too easy for one of the world's major piano competitions, because I've noticed that it has pretty much fallen out of use in terms of competitions. Grieg wrote some collections of piano music, a few songs, a few choral pieces. He's very heavily influenced by Norwegian folk song, Norwegian dances. He likes to use natural minor, the Aeolian mode, and he likes to use Lydian mode, so 1 minor, 1 major, but modal nonetheless. He often has drone notes in a bass instrument, and uses cross rhythms, combinations of 3/4 and 6/8 at the same time. And his phrasing is usually either 2 measures or 4 measures. So it's pretty clean, clear music, easy to identify its characteristics. Little bitty Denmark has an important composer. His name is Carl Nielsen. It's either E-N or O-N, I can't remember. I think it's E-N. The symphonies of Nielsen, I think, are very exciting. Some of them are just electrifying. And I would think that, that both players and audiences would like them a lot, because they're somewhat dissonant, but they are not severely dissonant. And they have a lot of tension and excitement in them. So if you ever have a chance to get acquainted with a Nielsen symphony, it's exciting music. You should do it. Little bitty Finland is represented by a composer you kind of know, Sibelius. And you've got Finlandia on your listening. That's one of his quite famous pieces. In Finland, winter is very long and very severe. It is snow on top of snow, on top of snow, on top of snow. And so the countryside in winter is a little bit bleak. Well, no, I take it back. It's very bleak because nothing's really alive and growing. Trees are sticks, and there's no sign of grass, and hardly any sign of any bushes or anything. The music of Sibelius then sort of reflects that. It's a little bit bleak and somber in its sound, just reflecting the Finnish countryside during winter. Sibelius is at his best in larger works that would be like symphonies. symphonic poems. He has an important violin concerto. And Sibelius' dates, by the way, 1865 to 1957. So he lives a little better than half his life in the 20th century. But the sound of his music is not a 20th century sound. It is a romantic sound. Clearly a romantic sounding composer. His habits of orchestration emphasize low registers and what we can call unmixed colors, that is to say, families. So you have passages of music for all strings, you have passages of music for all brass. He tends to, and this is in contrast, say, with the classical composer. Classical composer has a theme which will break down into little motives that are subject to development. Sibelius, on the other hand, starts with a motive and then gradually builds and expands that motive into a theme. So it's kind of the backwards procedure from the classical period. Also, motives that have been joined into a theme can be transferred into other themes. And so the recombination of motives can result in a new thematic structure. And one or two basic motives might even recur throughout an entire movement or even an entire symphony. That would be sort of the cyclical technique. As a romantic composer for Sibelius, certainly form is not as important as the musical content. And Sibelius is yet another composer who produces nothing of significance during the last 30 years of his life. How many of you are 30 yet? I don't see any hands. Okay. So these are long passages of time when composers basically have retired as composers. They do other things in music, but they're not composing anything of note. So add Sibelius to that list. It's during this period composers in the United States are ignoring their own national elements, even though we have plenty of them. We named some a while back. Revival songs, New England hymns, Stephen Foster songs, cowboy music, Indian music, spirituals, Creole music, all sorts of stuff. Instead, composers are writing in European styles. Like what? Well, English oratorio, Italian opera, German-type symphonies. As far as post-Romantic composers, the early celebrated ones would be two. One of them is Horatio Parker, P-A-R-K-E-R, and the other is Edward MacDowell, M-A-C-D-O-W-E-L-L. And they wrote some good vocal music, some good instrumental music. MacDowell was the first musical professorship at Columbia University in New York. The first truly great American composer. Still the greatest American composer is Charles Ives. 1874 to 1954. Ives learned a lot from his father. His father was a jack of all instruments, so to speak. There was almost nothing he couldn't play or learn to play in a pretty short amount of time. Yes, he played it at the amateur level, but with some capability. His father was kind of a fanatic about music. He experimented with a lot of songs. He exposed his son Charles to a lot of different kinds of music and heightened his sensibility towards all things musical. For example, churches sometimes have fellowship halls with old beat-up pianos in them, and they haven't been tuned in 20 years, and the acclimatization of the building's not very good, and so it's just outrageously out of tune. Some of the keys don't work. Well, he heard a lot of that in his town. Pretty modest place. There was a person in town, great big hulk of a guy. He was the blacksmith. And so while he would be banging stuff on the anvil all day long, he passed the time by singing at the top of his lungs. And he didn't match pitch real well. And so he started, his father cautioned him, no, it's beautiful. It sounds like the notes are wrong, but it has a beauty all its own. Well, a lot of these early experiences actually found their way into the very, very serious art music of Ives, because it sounds like traditional orchestras and traditional types of pieces with a lot of wrong notes in them, and a lot of dissonances, some of which are conventional, some of which are not very conventional, and a lot of snippets of familiar things, phrases of hymns, phrases of patriotic songs, things that people grew up with at the time that just sort of pop out of the texture, and then they're gone. So it's a very interesting sort of collage of musical things. But they're the product of all the kinds of things that he experienced when he was a youngster, kind of trained by his father. And his music deserves to be heard a lot more. It's very, very good. It's very, very high quality. He was not a self-taught composer. He actually studied music at Yale under Horatio Parker. They didn't get along too well because he was not interested in what Parker had to teach him. He was interested in his own ideas, in experimenting and trying out new things. So he was on the verge of being kicked out of the studio many times. Once he had finished his studies at Yale, which has always been a pretty high-toned place academically, he figured out that there was no way he was going to be able to make a living as a composer. And so he got himself a partner, and they got licensed, and they started an insurance agency. They sold insurance. And they became millionaires selling insurance. So, independently wealthy, he was able to have a cottage out in the Connecticut woods, very pretty, and he and his wife would go out there on weekends, and he would just hole up and write music and experiment and try stuff out in isolation like this. And the thing that's so remarkable about this is that a lot of the developments in his isolated music that nobody knew about actually anticipated a great many of the major things that happened in 20th century music, which other people got credit for, because they were more in the thick of things and people knew about it, whereas Ives was just out in the woods entertaining himself on weekends, and nobody knew about it, but we know about it now. So lots of dissonance, polytonality, polyrhythm, experimental forms, all sorts of things. His works include 5 symphonies. Those are major pieces. Around 200 or so songs, and some chamber music. Those would be among his most important works, symphony songs and chamber music. One of our former faculty members and I did a presentation of songs by Ives at TMEA some time back. It was very well received. All right, so fragments of folk songs, dance tunes, gospel tunes, Lutheran chorales, patriotic songs, all woven together into a very complex orchestral texture, but in fragmentary form, not in complete form, just little fragments of all of these things. Nationalism in England actually came a little bit later. And a major composer here is Sir Edward Elgar. Elgar. Elgar is the first truly English great composer since Purcell. Heck of a long time. So that you see how long. Elgar, 1857 to 1934. Anybody remember when Purcell died?
1695?
95, that's right, 1695. So we have gone really 2 centuries without a great English composer. I mean, in between, they claim Handel, but it's pretty difficult to stretch Handel into an English composer. He's a German composer who composed some stuff in English, but he is far from an English composer.
Why do you think the big F?
Because they were absorbed with things like Italian opera, stuff like that. And they had such a long multi-century tradition of choral music and organ music. And choral music and organ music weren't that big during a lot of that time. Not until composers like Elgar sort of brought it back. Important works. An orchestral piece called the Enigma Variations. The orchestra, the symphony has played it before, not in a while, I think. People have been trying to find out what the enigma really means behind it. Another one is an oratorio called The Dream of Gerontius. The Dream of Gerontius. Gerontius is spelled Gerontius. Gerontius. He's an English composer, but it's really hard to call him a nationalist composer because his music is not oriented around English folk song or English folk dances. It does sound English. And in fact, the works of Elgar start what we call an English Renaissance during the late 1800s. And it was to be carried on after him by other English composers. Those we'll deal with a little bit later. In Spain, the most important composer is Manuel de Falla. There is a lot of folk song influence in his, as well as a lot of influence from Debussy. So we can class him as a nationalist composer. France becomes an especially important country during this period, the end of the 1800s. A French Renaissance can be identified as starting in 1871. Well, what's 1871? 1871 marked the founding of the National Society for French Music. National Society for French Music. Now, this society was intending to encourage new composition by French composers, and also to mount performances of French music, both the new kind and from older French masters like Rameau and Gluck and Renaissance French composers as well. Well, as a result of the work of the National Society, there's quickly a rise in both the quantity and the quality of French music, both symphonic music and chamber music. As a result of their efforts during the first half of the 20th century, France again assumed a leading musical position in the world, and actually far outstripped its nationalistic beginnings and achieved a really cutting-edge position on the forefront of new developments. All right, well, as a result of the National Society, French music progressed in three different directions. Number one, the cosmopolitan tradition. And the leaders in this branch were César Franck and his pupil, d'Indy. d'Indy. You ever done a piece by d'Indy? Have you really? Yeah. d'Indy composes really fine music, and hardly anybody's doing it. Not really sure why. Franck is a mixture of conservative and progressive tendencies. He does work in the traditional forms, symphony, sonata, chamber music, oratorio, etc. The style of Franck is a mixture of homophony and counterpoint. Franck's music does maintain tonal centers. I don't want to call them keys. Tonal centers. But his music is very, very chromatic. It is certainly possible in Franck to be able to have the sound of parallel fifths, but the two notes involved have so many chromatic accidentals by them that they don't look like that at all on the page. They sound like that. So an awful lot of chromaticism. His works are very cyclical. You can count on material from the beginning happening all the way through. And all of these characteristics really are true of d'Indy as well. Remember that d'Indy's teacher was Franck. All right, the second direction then. Let's call it the French tradition. And this would be Saint-Saëns. And his student, Fauré. The French tradition. Now, this style is much more conservative. It is much more classical. It's marked by order and restraint and reserved simplicity. It is not a style typically of extravagance. It's very pretty. It's rather calm most of the time. It's totally the opposite of Berlioz, but we should remember that Berlioz was not especially successful in France either. work of Saint-Saëns is looked upon as having a great deal of perfection in the way it's composed. Very talented, high level of craftsmanship. And sensuous, charming melody was always highly appreciated in France. You can certainly say that about both Saint-Saëns and Fauré. Fauré, in fact, is one of the founders of the National Society for French Music. As we said, also a student of Saint-Saëns. A very calm, refined kind of style. Now, when we say this, we mean in general. Have you ever gone to the store to buy a new stereo system? You ever brought anything with you to play to see how it sounds and how the speakers can accommodate it and stuff like that? Well, if you ever get serious enough and want to spend that much money, bring along the Saint-Saëns organ symphony, because it's big. Now, be prepared to pay for what you blow out, if you're not careful. And I'm sure they'll make that clear to you, even though they won't know what it is that you're playing. But there are some places in that which just suddenly blare out of nowhere, very big, very loud. So if you're worried, be sure the wattage is okay on those. Fauré, no virtuosity, a little bit exotic sounding because it is nearly modal. And Fauré tends to avoid leading tones, that in fact the sevenths are lowered. That means that there is no strong pull towards a tonic. And that means that you don't have so much tension in the music. One chord sort of fades into another one sometimes. And notes that should resolve sometimes just become parts of other chords. They don't actually resolve. So the sound of Fauré is rather muted. It's not bright colors at all. Fauré, by the way, had no interest in orchestration. Very often, he would just write it out in a reduced form and then turn it over to somebody else to actually flesh it out for the orchestra. He just didn't like that sort of thing. Whether he didn't think he was any good at it or not, I don't know, or whether he just disliked the procedure so much, or whether he just couldn't be bothered, or what, I don't really know. But he didn't do very much of it himself. The most successful types of pieces for Fauré would be the small scale pieces, chamber music, songs. A lot of Fauré songs are well known in song literature. Fauré is one of those who upholds the conservative classical tradition at a time when it was not very popular to do that. That the right thing to do was go for the avant-garde type stuff instead. All right, the third branch would be Impressionism. And of course, the big name in Impressionism is Debussy, of course, and also secondarily to him, Ravel. Ever done a piece by Debussy? If you haven't, you're going to. Debussy is quite simply one of the most influential composers of the 20th century. hardly any important composer escaped the influence of Debussy. He's one of the most seminal figures, really, in the history of music, but specifically towards the 20th century. The term Impressionism, of course, is another one that we have stolen from art. And Impressionism in art is primarily represented by the paintings of Monet, M-O-N-E-T. Impressionism in music attempts to evoke moods and sensations, impressions, through harmony and tone color. So it's almost like program music, except that it's intended to be very vague. It is intended to just be slightly suggestive, and that the listener needs to supply the rest, whatever details might occur to you. And the same in painting. When you look at the painting, it's not like a snapshot. It's not clear. It's fuzzy. It's foggy. It's blurry. You see generalities, but then you have to supply the actual details. So definitely impressionistic music does not tell a story. It just sets an atmosphere. The listener supplies the rest. So there's understatement, there's allusion. It is not the strong expression of the other romantics. It's the opposite of that. He typically uses a large orchestra, but that large orchestra seldom plays very loudly. Most of the time they play some shade of soft. Okay, Debussy's important enough. Let's make a list of his style characteristics. Divided strings, strings with mutes, flute in its sexy low register, soloistic passages for English horn and oboe, unusual instruments like harp are actually main staples of his orchestra. Brass instruments with mutes. A wide variety of percussion instruments. So, yes, of course, timpani, but also sometimes other drums, large and small cymbals, celeste, glockenspiel, xylophone, tam-tam. The use of pedal tones. Unresolved dissonances which slip into other chords. Elided cadences. Few pauses. Concealed form. And in parentheses, you could put, but a preference for ABA form. Although it's darned hard to find it. 7th, 9th, 11th, and 13th chords. Slow harmonic rhythm. exotic scales, like the pentatonic scale and the whole tone scale. Here's an important one. Parallel chords of the same type. Parallel chords of the same type. What's the word for this?
Planing?
Planing is right. Planing. So let's say it's a seventh chord. Seventh chords are supposed to resolve, right? Well, they don't. It's just seventh chords that travel parallel to each other. None of them resolving, just going to the next one. All right, and then finally, whirling figuration within stasis. Whirling figuration within stasis. What does that mean? It means that there's something happening over and over and over and over and over and over and over. It's like something that's arpeggiated, which gives you the feeling of movement, but in fact nothing's happening. It's not going anywhere. It's just the feeling of movement while it's just sitting there. All right, that's a pretty good list. From time to time, there's been something called, among other things, the World's Fair. In this case, the Paris Exposition, 1889. It was right there, so of course Debussy attended the Paris Exposition. At these things, many, many countries of the world represent themselves in great big exhibits. So you see their native costumes, you see their art, you see folk type stuff, and of course music. So Debussy, experiencing little bits of music from the far corners of the world, was really taken by the sounds of little far-flung places like Bali, like Java, little bitty places that are, not really in the modern era yet because they're so removed. And so, insofar as he was able to understand these things and represent them in sound, they find their way into the sound of his art music. In addition, Fauré rubbed elbows with other important artistic people, poets, writers, painters, dancers, actors, etc. He'd sit and drink coffee with them and drink wine at the bistros and things like that, and they would talk about stuff. So he became saturated with impressionistic philosophy. Wanting to participate in this, he set out to create suggestive sensory effects in musical sound. And this is no small task. For example, what kind of a musical sound would you write to represent moonlight? You're sitting there with staff paper. Moonlight. What do you do? Or splashing water, or sunlight, or leaves fluttering in the breeze, or hot and humid, or cool, or something like that. How do you represent all of that in music? So, this is quite a problem, quite a task for him to undertake. He took influences from the Paris Exposition. He took plenty of influences from previous composers as well. Lots of important music by Debussy because of what it is and what it started and how it influenced other people. Now, not everybody liked that. And so, there was another composer named Satie. Anybody ever run into Satie before?
Mm-hmm.
What was
Did a report on him for Songlit. He was like the grandfather of the avant-garde movement.
Okay, in a way, one of the things he's known for is that he did satirical caricatures of impressionistic music. So he actually has a set of pieces called Gymnopédie, which means clouds or something like that. And they're boring as can be.
Mm-hmm.
Hardly anything happens of any interest whatsoever. And that was sort of his criticism of Impressionism, that in fact there's this atmosphere, this mood, but that's it. And so he's poking fun at Impressionism. He is, however, a minor composer. Well, the other important Impressionist, of course, is Ravel. He's a little less important than Debussy, but of course Debussy's at the top. Ravel's a little bit more classically oriented a composer. So his melody has clean melodic phrase shapes, more distinct rhythm, more standard form. His harmony, although it's a little bit complex with the kind of tall chords that we mentioned, is still more functional than Debussy's. So, yes, it's clearly impressionistic, but it is less purely impressionistic than Debussy's. All right, so a matter of degree. One of the things you can say about Ravel is that he was one of the most brilliant orchestrators in the history of orchestration. He knew how to get any color, any effect he wanted. He prepared his scores with great care, great perfection. Every tiny little detail checked, double-checked, triple-checked, so that it was published exactly the way he wanted it. He didn't write a lot of music, but he is a composer of quite significant importance. All right, well, still going on at all this time, you have Italian opera. It flourishes. We, as we mentioned recently, have gotten into the style of verismo, meaning realism. Real people, real emotions, real situations, things that the viewer and listener could identify with. So everyday people, familiar situations, but they're acting violently under the impulse of strong, fundamental, almost primitive emotions. Definitely one of the leading figures in verismo. Would be Puccini. And people who know anything about opera actually are very familiar with a number of operas by Puccini. Some of them I'm sure have heard of, like La Bohème is one of them. Tosca, another one. He did have a flair for foreign exoticism. So, for example, an opera like Madame Butterfly is set in Japan. Another one called Turandot is set in China. And all of his operas have very strong emotional music to reflect the intensity of emotion in the libretto. In verismo, which Puccini is the big name. There are a couple of lesser composers. One of them is Mascagni. He's basically known for one opera, Cavalleria Rusticana. The other one, Leon Cavallo, is known for one opera, I Pagliacci, the clown, I the clown. So, in terms of verismo, just pure verismo, Puccini is by far the big name. There are other composers we've mentioned who were getting into it also as a component of their operas. Chief of whom, I guess, Verdi, because as we said, he has characters acting under strong emotions there as well. In any case, these are operas that the audiences go crazy for. All the major opera houses tend to do them. Well, as I think we said once before, the 20th century has been marked from its beginnings with a lot of international tension. World War I was said at the time to be the war to end all wars. Certainly no, that's not true. It didn't. The Austrian Empire, which was very important and has quite a few important historical characters that came out of it, was shattered and became several independent countries. 1917 saw the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. 1922, the fascists, led by Mussolini, take over Italy. Shortly thereafter, Hitler and his Nazis turned Germany into a dictatorship. Generalissimo Francisco Franco ruled and isolated Spain for a great deal of the 20th century. He lived an awfully long time. So a bunch of countries then developed a much more isolationist stance regarding one another. They're in turmoil. Music experienced similar turmoil. We mentioned modal music several times, just in the last little bit. This diffused tension and weakened the pull of dominant and tonic. We have a new movement that's coming up. Atonality. When we use the word tonality, we mean what again?
The feeling of
Key.
a key.
Yeah. Atonality. No key. No feeling of key. We have rhythmic and metric irregularities. Complexity becomes normal in that regard. And as a result of all of these progressions, there starts to be a divorce between the composer and the audience. And it got to be pretty bad. And a few composers realized this. So there were some of them who created their own little movement to try to bring the composer and the audience back together again. Successful to various extents, I suppose. The composer Hindemith in Germany. Hindemith. Developed something called Gebrauchsmusik. Gebrauchsmusik. Gebrauchsmusik really means useful music. In other words, it's music for good amateurs, that you don't have to actually be a world-class professional to play it. Kodály in Hungary developed an educational program based upon folk song. Nazi occupations, however, drove a lot of artistic activity underground. If it was going on, it had to be done in secret in the countries they occupied. And the Nazis exercised strict censorship over music. Why would that be?
Doctrine of ethos.
The doctrine of ethos, that's right. That music can influence people's thoughts, emotions, and behavior. And they didn't want to have music of a particular country fomenting revolt against them and making life difficult for them. And also because the music they wanted it to glorify the Reich. They wanted music to have that purpose, a political purpose. So difficult in many countries. Then, on top of all that, we had the Great Depression, which you've been hearing about some lately. The Great Depression we tend to think of as an American phenomenon. It was not. It was worldwide. It was not just us. It was everywhere. It affected music making significantly since hardly anybody had any money. And the people who did have money, the money wasn't worth anything. The Germans kind of inflated themselves out of existence there for a while. They had bills to pay. They figured this was the way to do it, just devalue the money so that they'd be able to pay it off. Unfortunately, it sort of looks like Ben Bernanke is thinking the same way nowadays. So it seems like it's okay right now, but in a few years, if we had hyperinflation, that would be bad. Everybody would feel poor. If our debt gets to be so bad that the world throws up its hands and figures, you all never going to pay that off because you can't. We need something besides the dollar to be the reserve currency of the world. If the dollar were not the reserve currency, a loaf of bread could cost $25 or $30 or $50. Oil could go to $500 a barrel instead of whatever it is now, 90-something. I mean, everything would just become prohibitively expensive. We're taught that it was really World War II that brought us out of the Depression, and to a large extent that is true. We're also taught that President Roosevelt, who had part of a fourth term as president, did a whole bunch of stuff which helped and helped and helped and helped and helped. And that is false. We forget that there was a terrible depression in about 1921. And they didn't do anything. And in a normal amount of time, it worked itself out just fine. And we had the Roaring '20s as a result. It was great. And then it overheated and blew up again. And as it was doing so, the president, who was Herbert Hoover at the time, who was one of the most brilliant people ever to be president, started doing things to fix it. And it made it worse. And so in the next election, he lost. And we got Franklin Roosevelt. And he did even more, and it got worse. And then they staggered around wondering what the heck to do for a term, and by not doing anything, it started to get better. So they thought, aha, we've got it. And so in the third term, they did a whole bunch more stuff, and so the Depression hit just as bad as before. Then in his fourth term, we had Pearl Harbor. And so instead of the government trying to control everything, they basically just turned it over to industry and said, okay, we need all this war material, have at it. And by turning industry loose again, the way it hadn't been since the 20s, then all of a sudden everything got so much better. Not to say that it wasn't difficult, because once the war